Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story review. This one is contained in the December 1968 edition of If, or If, Worlds of If. The cover does not match any of the drawing or the story, but at least we do have the title and his name. Holmes-Ginsbook device by Isaac Asimov. At least that is mentioned on the cover. Needless to say, it is also mentioned inside the table of contents. Furthermore, it is the first story included in this magazine, with some degree of importance. So, we turn to the page. There's no artwork. Very small blurb. It says, in science, the double feel licks a one-pinch effect every time. I don't get that blurb. It does say illustrated by Gagan, and there is one picture associated, and that seems to be there. Interesting portrait of, I guess it's supposed to be Isaac Asimov. That looks like him. So, I don't know, the fancy woman and little bowls of, I don't know, some sort of computer or book films, like you sometimes hear mentioned in some of his earlier stories. It actually says it here, not all part Asenium and Odia's part ad nocil, I don't know. Anyway, looks like a cigarette. Oh, and it looks like he's going to grab it by the end. It's on fire, which actually is part of the theme in the story. Well, I might as well dive into the story itself. And by the way, I did not discern any differences between that as it appeared in If versus how it has appeared in one place. It seems to have been gathered up anywhere since then. That is in his Opus 100. It appears, in fact, in there as literally the last story. It puts it under the category of humor. It includes just that one lone short story. Let's see what he has to say about it. Alright, in some ways, my most unexpected excursion, to myself anyway, is into the realm of humor. For many years, my writings were singularly free of humor, to my own astonishment and rather to that of others as well, for in my social life I am well known as an authentically funny fellow. Good sense tells me not to say this myself, that I may as well indulge in one of my delightful Asimovian immodesties. One more won't kill me any deader than I am by now. The thing is that I am offhandedly witty. I am perfectly capable of telling jokes all evening without repeating myself. Clean jokes yet. And I can give an extemporaneous talk on any subject before any audience and have them in the aisles. In fact, on those few occasions when I have addressed a scientific convention and given a legitimate scientific talk of the kind that later gets published in a solemn scientific journal, I still have them laughing. So why is my writing so sober? I'm not sure. Lack of self-confidence, perhaps. Every once in a while I did write what I consider to be a humorous science fiction story. I invariably loved it and died laughing when I reread it. In each case I managed to sell it, and in each case a kind of solemn silence swallowed it up, and it was never heard of again. Yeah, especially in the earlier days, there actually were quite a number of failed attempts at humor. Sometimes he would kind of, sort of, a little bit, maybe a general atmosphere of mild humor, but the really good roll in the aisle type of thing, that is rarely achieved, and that's the kind of humor that sells as humor and not really whatever else it may be. Fortunately, a turning point came in 1962, and it happened after this fashion. Well, it gives a whole story about that. Let's see how much here. He mentions Timothy Seldes, who was then his editor at Doubleday and helped him to buy the Gnome Press publications from Gnome Press so that Doubleday could print I, Robot and the Foundation trilogy. So he's talking about how the Opus 100 book came about. So that's what that's really talking about. So does this mean I can write a humorous science fiction story after all? I decided to try again. It came about because Esquire magazine. Now this will explain some of the content of this story because it seems like, what is he doing? But I think I get this. Esquire is I think it's kind of like a predecessor of Playboy kind of a thing. Not quite so obviously raunchy, but definitely oriented towards men wanting to do some serious advanced girl watching. Was planning a special issue and asked me to contribute. I suggested a satirical piece. You see, it was beginning to go to my head, and they agreed. But when I sat down to write the article, it turned into a science fiction story. I can't help it. I tell anyone who listens that there is a little man inside me that does the writing, that he is quite beyond my control, and that I just sit there at the typewriter and read what comes out in utter fascination. When I reread what I had written this time, however, I realized that it was a satire on the Double Helix. Now, this is an interesting piece of background. So, unfortunately, I have not read the Double Helix, but apparently it might be a book worth reading if you want to capture the full humor of the story. That excellent book written by James D. Watson, which tells the history of the discovery of the structure of DNA in utterly human terms. The humor in my story depends partly on the reader having read the Double Helix, or at least having read about the Double Helix. But so what? The Double Helix being the structure of DNA. So, anyone who is sufficiently interested in science fiction, or in me, to buy this rather heterogeneous mishmash of a book, Opus 100, that is, he means, okay, you are now holding, is bound to know about the Double Helix. But when I sent the story to Esquire, it turned out that either they had never heard of the Double Helix, or feared their readers hadn't, so they rejected it. See, I even get rejects in the year 1968. I'm human. Hey, I still get rejections. Yeah, right. I didn't care. I sent it to Fred Pohl, and he took it for his magazine, If, which is where we find it. At least he took it after a little hesitation. He wrote and said he would like to cut it in half. He must have had some obscure reason for that, but who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of editors. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of editors. Okay. I wrote back rather humbly and said I didn't want to sound like Harlan Ellison, a tremendously talented science fiction writer who was known throughout the field for his trigger temper and his refusal to take any lip from any editor. But the story had to be published in toto for two reasons. One, it was a satire on the Double Helix, and the satirical point would be killed if it were cut. And two, it was the only story I had ever written in which I wrote as ribaldly as I talked, and I might never do it again, so I didn't want to lose one precious paragraph. Consequently, said I, he felt that if I had to cut it, would he return the manuscript instead? Whereupon Fred answered and said he would print it in full, and I did too, sound like Harlan Ellison, which was a terrible thing to say. Anyway, here's the story, which concludes the book. It is the last story or sample of his writing included in Opus 100. Okay. Let's see here. Concludes the book in symmetrical fashion. The first inclusion was a piece of the very first science fiction story I managed to write and sell, and the last inclusion is the very latest, so far, science fiction story I managed to write and sell 30 years later. So, the Holmes-Ginsbook device. Okay. So, it only appeared in one other place, which is If at that time. Okay. So, what is the Holmes-Ginsbook device? Well, we start with there seems to be about three figures of importance here. There is somebody called Mike, which is really short for Myron Ginsbook. So it's really Myron Ginsbook, but people shorten his name to Mike. Okay, that's one important part. He's obviously half of the important equation here. And there's an I. I'm not seeing it that I has a name or not. So let's see here. Understood little at first, asked questions, and then there was a Derek, Paul Derek. He was a California wizard, but dead now. So I guess there's the I, the first person. If I don't see his name, I'll just call him the first person. So the first person, and Mike, Mitch. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, so I guess our I is Holmes. Something Holmes, or Holmes something, I don't know. Because the device, Mike and the first person, Holmes, will, by the end of the story, have invented something. Well, first it starts with our good friend Derek, who is trying to invent a better way to smoke a cigarette. Apparently, cigarettes had some sort of a self-igniting feature that if you put it in your mouth and you just breathe it in, and somehow it just automatically lights itself up and starts going along. After that, working more or less the way all of us expect a cigarette to function. But apparently it would sometimes happen, and people would get all these little burn marks and stuff on their mouths and tongues and so forth, because the ends look so much alike. It was easy to pick it up the wrong way, put that in your mouth, and you suck, and all of a sudden a little flame out happens in your mouth. And that could be very, very uncomfortable. So he decides to try to invent some way to have a cigarette not do that. And he comes up with all this idea. He struggles with this quite a while, in fact. But he ends up getting a Nobel Prize for inventing a way for the cigarette not to risk burning your mouth. There's even he came up with this great idea, and he called it a match of any great idea. Let's see, maybe I can find it. Finally, he decided on a thin shaft of wood as ideal for the purpose. Since it was difficult to balance a cigarette tip on the wood, he discarded the tobacco and paper and made use of the chemicals with which the cigarette tip had been impregnated. These chemicals he coated on the tip of the shaft. At first, he lost considerable time trying to make the shaft hollow so that it could be sucked or blown through to ignite the chemicals. The resulting fire might then be applied to the cigarette. This, however, revived the original problem. What if one put the wrong end of the shaft in the head? Then he got his crowning idea. It would only be necessary to increase the temperature of the chemicals by friction by rubbing the tip of the wood against a rough surface. This was absolutely safe, for if, in the course of bestowing a fatherly kiss on the lips of a girl student and 10 on an A, there's an awful lot of girl watching stirred in. I mean, even his cigarettes have pictures of girls on them, and girly cigarette, girly this and girly that, all over. So they must have been written for Esquire magazine. So whatever. All right. Typical event: one should rub the wrong end of the wood on a rough surface. Nothing at all would happen. It was a perfectly fail-safe mechanism. The discoverer swept the world. Who today is without his package of ignosplints, ignosplints, which can be lit at any time in perfect safety so that the day of the blistered lip is gone forever. Surely this great invention is a match for any other this great century has seen. So much a match, in fact, that some have suggested that ignosplints be called matches. Yeah. That's an interesting etymology of the word match. In other words, light it up with a match, and then you can hold the match. If you do the wrong end of the match, nothing happens. Yeah. Do the correct end, it all works the way it should, and the way we all expect. You've got a fire, you use that to light your cigarette, and you just light the end that's away from your mouth, and so you won't burn your mouth. Perfect. What a brilliant invention. Wow. There's kind of a sense of, we forget all the previous, let's see here. Here was a guy born on January 1, 2001, so he is as old as the century exactly, and I am 10 years younger, that much farther removed from the unmentionable 20th. Oh, I mentioned it sometimes. All youngsters have their quirks, and mine has been a curiosity about mankind's earlier history, concerning which so little is known and so little, I admit, ought to be known. But I was curious. It was Mike who rescued me in those days. Don't, he would say, leering at the girls as they passed in their bikini business suits and leaning over at intervals to feel the material judiciously. Don't play with the past. Oh, ancient history isn't bad, nor medieval times, but as soon as we reach the birth of technology, forget it. From then on, it's scatology, just filth and perversion. You are the future of the 21st. Be free. Breathe deeply of our century's clean air. It will do wonders for you. Okay, well, there's more of that. But at any rate, so I guess this idea where somebody just punched clear at the beginning of the new millennium, and we decided to forget everything. So nobody knows, and nobody knew how to operate a cigarette till Mr. Paul Derrick, finally invented the match to go with the cigarette. Okay. So having done all that, now our first person and his friend Mike decide to try to come up with something as well. So what are they going to do? Well, the problem is he squinted microfilms. How did this happen? Well, somebody missed out on some particularly exciting girl-watching targets because they were trying to study the way you read, which was with a microfilm, and you had to either have this viewer all around your head or with straining your eye at some tiny little thing or something. It's like, here's an idea. What if we expand it out? And then they said, well, what are we going to do next? Put it on a great big piece of paper, put it on a long piece of paper, and put it down a wall, climb up high and put it so it's out of harm's way, I guess. And you could go along with the ladder and slide it along, like sometimes you see those places with high shelves and so forth might have a ladder that kind of slides along, I guess, and you go and read it. Or he ends up coming up with an idea, well, let's make it long but roll it up at each end so you can put it on a couple of sticks like a scroll. Finally, he comes up with the idea of, what if we put a whole bunch of them together and make it like a book as we know them. So Holmes-Ginsbook, and the whole thing is, for some reason, they shortened it to just a book. Get all the rest. So it's a book. Like, that's a great big invention. Well, the codex was quite a fascinating invention back in the early days. It actually, the history of that is rather surprising because in the ancient days, everybody did write on scrolls for thousands of years, as far as we knew. Anything that couldn't be done on a single page. So when the Christians started going about needing to show people texts and so forth, trying to scroll was really lengthy and a pain in the whatever. So what they did was they developed what we now call the codex, which is just the standard structure as normal books as we know them now. You like a hardback or paperback book. It has a very specific structure. And so this purports to be like an origin story of the book. And so apparently he gets a Nobel Prize. He and Mike together share a Nobel Prize for having invented this device, this book, this Holmes-Ginsbook device. It's all satire, and I'm sure it would be even more fun if I had read the Double Helix. So anyone who has is welcome to add something in the comments that would come from this. So that's all I have on the Holmes-Ginsbook